Okay, in this chapter, chapter 5, we're going to focus on the cognitive development of infants and toddlers. So let's go ahead and get started. So one of the key figures really in this field of cognitive development is Piaget, and you probably have heard of Piaget before. He has a concept called adaptation. So basically, first babies are going to assimilate, and basically what that means is they're using a current scheme to interpret the world. So let's pretend that you have a pet cat, and the baby has learned that this little furry thing is called a cat. When you go to a neighbor's house who has a dog, the baby's going to call the dog a cat because that's the only schema that they have. But after you have provided them with some feedback about this, no, honey, that's not really a cat, that's a dog. And then you have to differentiate what makes the difference between a cat and a dog. So maybe you talk about the sounds that they make or whatever it might be. Then after they've done that, they'll be able to go ahead and call the dog a dog. So basically this process of accommodation means they're creating new schemas or adjusting old ones to fit the new data that they're creating. And that's really how learning takes place. Well, Piaget's cognitive developmental approach has 4 primary stages in it. The first stage is the sensory motor period, and this is from birth until age 2. During this stage, they're coordinating the sensory input with motor action. So you know babies during this stage are basically touching and smelling and tasting and everything they can. Using their senses, and they're exploring, in a physical way as best they can also. There's a concept called object permanence, and what that means is that a baby knows that something exists even though they can't see it. Well, in the beginning of the sensory motor period, the babies do not have this concept of object permanence, and they don't develop it usually until about 18 months or so. So if you have a baby who's, say, 8 months, 9 months old, and they, want something that you're holding, maybe a rattle or something, and for whatever reason you don't want them to have it, all you need to do is hide it, and they're going to stop whining and complaining about it because they don't even know it exists anymore. They won't even know to look for it. But by the time they get to be 1.5 years or 2, that trick's not going to work anymore. They're going to go ahead and search for it, and they'll search high and far for it. So you're going to have to know that they're going to go after that. Now, the sensory motor period can be broken up into even more specific stages. So let's go ahead and just take a look, and we'll walk through these different stages. The primary circular reaction stage is basically the first 4 months, and it has to do with their own body. Primary, kind of think about them. They're the primary part of their world right now. So this is where you see babies kind of sucking on their fists or their toes, and they're just exploring really kind of who they are. Secondary circular reaction happens from 4 to 8 months, and this is when they start to interact with the outside world, but it's a little bit accidental in nature. So maybe you have the baby underneath one of those mobiles that might be in their crib, or it might be just kind of above them as they're laying on the ground, and they knock into a toy accidentally. That's considered the secondary circular reaction stage. If they like that reaction that they got and now they're going to go ahead and do it in a more purposeful way, that would be this coordination of secondary circular reaction. So it's still this, but now it's a more purposeful interaction. So I'm going to kick this because I liked the noise that made. The next stage is called tertiary circular reaction, and this is 12 to 18 months. What happens here is that now they're not just satisfied with that mobile that's on top of them. They want to go and investigate to see what other options exist. So now they're going looking for hidden objects. They're looking in your cabinets. They're opening up things that might have been closed. And that's really where they're doing a lot more exploration. So it's still with the external environment, but in a much more sophisticated kind of way. That mental representation happens between 18 months and 2 years, and that's where object permanence happens. This is a key element for make-believe play, and we all know how important play is for children. You can't engage in make-believe play without being able to know an object exists, even when you can't see it. So it's kind of the precursor for that. There's some really cool research out there on infant memory. Basically, Ruby Collier, who actually is a researcher at Rutgers University, not too far away from us, has done a lot on infant memory. And you can see this picture of a mobile here. You can see that babies have learned different kinds of things about that mobile. But what her research shows is that it really is very specific. And if you change the mobile, you change the environment, the learning isn't that kind of solid. So it really is a temporary kind of situation, but it is showing some evidence of learning. If I asked you what your earliest childhood memory was, most of you would probably tell me something around the age of 3 or older. And the reason that you can't remember birth to 3 is not because necessarily good things or bad things didn't happen or nothing memorable happened. It's really because of the way that your brain has been developing. So the frontal lobe is not that developed when you're a young child, and it develops more as you're moving along. So that's one of the reasons for this phenomenon called infantile amnesia. But another very powerful reason, it has to do with language. If you think about it, our language really doesn't kick off until about age 3 or so. And what happens is that we store memories in a verbal format. So if I ask you to recall something, you're going to be able to recall it, and you're going to share a story with me about all those details. Well, prior to age 3, when you don't have that much language, you are actually storing your memories in more of a picture format. And we're not using that format now to retrieve memories. So it's still in there, but it's tougher to access. If you think about it as a computer, maybe you're just kind of trying to access something from a Mac computer and you're using a PC. It might be on the flash drive, but you just can't kind of pull it up. It doesn't really work that way. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. This theorist, Vygotsky, is one of my favorites, really, of the class. He talks about sociocultural theory, and we'll be revisiting him quite a bit throughout the different developmental stages. But I want to introduce you to his theory now. So basically, Piaget focuses on the cognitive approach and really kind of zooms in primarily on cognitive functioning. Well, Vygotsky says that if you want to look at cognitive functioning, you can't do that unless you're also looking at language and you're looking at that person's social-cultural environment. So he says all these 3 variables kind of work together and are key elements in understanding our cognitive growth. And you can even hear that played out a little bit. I mean, if you're struggling with a problem that you're trying to solve, you may talk it out loud, and that's where language comes in. You're probably going to work maybe with somebody else, either a teacher or a tutor or a classmate or someone in your family to help you understand that, because when we use all these variables together, it's much more likely that you'll learn. Vygotsky has 2 key concepts. The first one is called the zone of proximal development. And basically what that is what is something that child can do if they had support. So they can't do it yet by themselves. It's kind of within reach, but not doable yet. And then scaffolding is the second concept. What kind of scaffold or support would the child need in order to be able to pull off the task? You can see this picture of training wheels here. It's a great example of Vygotsky at work. So a child may not be able to ride a 2-wheeler by themselves, but if you put the training wheels on them, they probably sure can do it, assuming you're getting them at the right age and their gross motor skills are well developed. Now, when we look at infant development, there are actually tests out there that will test for infant IQ, and they can do this from as young as 1 month old all the way up to about 3.5 years old. And you can see here are the kinds of variables that they're looking at and assessing. So do you think that this will predict their future IQ? Well, the answer is no. It's a terrible predictor actually of their future IQ. If you look at IQ scores in this range and we compare them later on when they're 8, 9, 10 years old, you're going to see a pretty poor correlation between the 2. So then you might say, well, what's the point then if they're not good predictors? Well, the one real important point of using these is that they can tell whether or not a baby is developing on track. And this can be really important because early intervention is needed if they are not developing on schedule and on track. So if they're lagging behind in any area, whether it's a physical area, a cognitive area, whatever it might be, using an infant development scale such as this one, the Bayley scale, is going to really help you kind of move forward in predicting and who might need some additional assistance. The last concept I want to talk to you a little bit about is infant language development. So I'm going to give you the very, very easy version. Your author is going to give you some more information to kind of share with you more of the complexities of this process. But one very easy way to kind of determine whether a child's on track with language is by age 1, they should know 1 word. Age 2, they should know 2 words. And age 3, they should know 3 words, which is also known as sentences. So that's a very, very general way to look at the development of language in children. But I should note here, if you see this concept of telegraphic speech at age 2, just because they're only using 2 words like more, eat, it really does have the meaning of a sentence. So it's not like 2 meaningless words like the cat. they're actually choosing, kind of two of the most meaningful words of the sentence. I want more to eat. More eat is really going to communicate what they're looking for. So that's called telegraphic speech. So go ahead and dive into the chapter so you can discover a lot more about how language develops and certainly cognitive development of these youngsters too. Okay, in Chapter 4, we're going to begin the journey of looking at the infant and the toddler, and you'll notice that what your author does, Laura Burke, what she does is kind of looks at physical, cognitive, social, emotional development. So we're going to start off looking at the physical development in infancy and toddlerhood. So let's go ahead and get started. So the very first year, we just got finished looking at prenatal development, and I'm assuming you're going to be just kind of in awe of how much happens over that 9-month period of time. Well, physical growth really continues to happen in a very, very significant way over the course of the first year. In fact, you can see there's a 50% increase in growth in terms of length, and in terms of birth weight, they triple in size. So babies are doing quite a lot during that very first year. If we take a look at brain development, it's pretty cool to see how much is happening in terms of their brain development. So a couple of things I want to bring your attention to. First of all, the stimulation is really important. You can read a little bit about what happens to a baby who is not exposed to any stimulation, but we don't want to over stimulate our babies either. So too much isn't necessarily good, but we do need to have opportunities for that neural development. So we want to present them with opportunities for learning. There are a couple of times that the glial cells end up becoming pretty significant, and this is during pregnancy through age 2, and then later on, again, we'll talk about this when we get to the adolescent years. And the key here with these glial cells is that they are responsible for myelination. Myelination, if you recall from your intro to psych days and how neural communication works, is if you just kind of think about all the neural pathways that are in the brain, you see all of these, the insulation kind of wraps itself around there, which allows the messages to happen in a much more efficient manner. So these glial cells really do play a very important role because we need to establish very efficient neural pathways. Pretty cool stuff. So there are two different kinds of experiences that we're going to look at. The experience-dependent neural connections, and the other is experience-expectant. Experience-dependent is that the synapse connections are created because of your experiences. So something happens, and as a result of that experience, your brain reacts and creates a neural pathway for you. Now, that happens, all the time when we're engaged in learning, for sure. We're kind of creating new pathways. Hopefully that's happening even to you right now. But experience expectant is when these connections were actually created for experiences. So in essence, what happens is that the brain is expecting certain things to happen. Where they're expecting you to learn to walk, or, around age 1 to 2. They're expecting, you to begin talking in much more significant ways around age 3 or so. So they kind of do the red carpet treatment in your brain, and they kind of have these pathways all paved out for you and ready to go. Whereas with the experience dependent that we talked about first, there's no red carpet treatment, but they're certainly ready to go ahead and roll it out when you're ready. So it's not waiting for you, but it's going to respond to what you're doing. So we certainly have tons and tons of neurons, as you can see here, and lots of synapses. The key is we need to develop good neural pathways and really establish those. And we do that through learning. And a lot of that happens naturally without a significant amount of effort. And in some cases, it might require a little bit more effort. One of the areas I wanted to point your attention to was the area of breastfeeding. I know there's a lot of different literature out there on breastfeeding, and I wanted to share this one study with you. I know it's a little bit dated, but it's a pretty powerful study because it was looking at the developmental impact of breastfeeding on child development at 5 years old. So it was a longitudinal study. So remember from our first chapter, a longitudinal study tracks the same children all across time. So it's pretty cool to have one of those kinds of studies because, as I said before, most researchers are not that patient in waiting that long for the results of their study. So what these researchers hypothesized is they thought that breastfeeding would have a positive impact, and the impact or dependent variable that they were interested in was cognitive functioning. And they thought that this would go above and beyond anything that had to do with family and social variables, so that there would be kind of an independent benefit of breastfeeding. So if you look at the study, you'll certainly see how large in scale it is, which speaks also to the power of the study. We had over 7,000 infants at birth, and then they had almost 4,000 at 5 years, which is a significant amount. So, clearly many parents may no longer be interested in doing the study, but they might move away, all different kinds of things happen. So this is a pretty good turnout for the study. So here's how they did the study. They looked at breastfeeding, and they obviously couldn't do an experimental study because that wouldn't have been very ethical to require some parents to breastfeed and others not. That wouldn't work so well. So instead, they're doing what's called a quasi-experimental study, which means it kind of looks like an experiment, but it doesn't have the randomization. So we know that's a pretty critical point, but you'll see what they did to kind of compensate for it. It doesn't fix the problem, but it certainly does help a little bit. So here's what they did, is they categorized folks into either not breastfeeding at all, doing it for less than 3 weeks, 3 to 7, 7 weeks to 4 months, 4 to 6 months, or 6 months or more. Okay, this was the independent variable. The dependent variable is the cognitive functioning, and they looked at receptive language. So that's how well are they able to understand language. Now you'll notice here there's a list of confounding variables. So what they did, because they knew they couldn't control for these via random assignment, is they assessed all of the kinds of variables that they thought might have an impact on receptive language. So they looked at things such as birth weight, an APGAR score, some physical conditions, whether or not they were in daycare, where they looked at stimulation because they know that has a big impact on neural pathways and development, maternal education, depression, anxiety, the list goes on. I just grabbed a few here so you could have an idea of the extent of it. So by doing that, they're able to actually statistically kind of remove the effects of all the confounding variables, so then you're looking at the effects of breastfeeding on cognitive functioning. Still, we're not going to be able to talk in terms of causation, but we are going to be able to feel a lot more confident in the results than if they didn't assess for all these other variables. So here's what they found. They found that the infants who were breastfed for at least 6 months had significantly higher cognitive scores on the PPVT, which is an assessment inventory, the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, and it basically assesses their receptive language, how well do they understand. And this was true even after they statistically controlled for all those confounding variables. Now, what we look at here are the differences in IQ testing. So if you know anything about IQ tests, the average is 100. In fact, the average range is 90 to 109. So we're not saying that the babies who were not breastfed were, in the low average or, anything like that. They still were in the average range. But this is a pretty significant finding. So although both groups were in the average range, we can see this was almost a 10-point difference. And an IQ score, that's pretty significant. And it certainly was statistically significant. So pretty powerful stuff that, we want to really emphasize to parents that they want to breastfeed for at least 6 months. Okay, now one of the other topics in this chapter has to do with how do babies learn. So I'm just going to give you a quick refresher. My hope is that you recall some good old favorites from Intro to Psych like Pavlov and classical conditioning. So if you remember his famous experiment with the dog and the salivation, we're going to look at what happened before the dog was conditioned. So in the beginning, the dog was presented with meat powder. And when that happens, a dog is going to automatically salivate. You don't need to train the dog to do that. It happens automatically. And that is going to be an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. Because basically the word conditioned means learned. So means not. It was a not learned stimulus with a not learned response. Okay, then the bell is something that is called a neutral stimulus, and the reason it's neutral is because nothing happens. So if the dog hears a bell, unless it learns something, it will not do anything in response to that bell. Now, conditioning takes place. So what happened was, if you recall from that study, is every time before the meat powder was presented, a bell rang. So it was bell, meat powder, bell, meat powder, bell, meat powder. So the dog started to connect those two stimuli after numerous pairings. And now the bell became a conditioned stimulus, which then produced the salivation, which was a conditioned response. Again, conditioned means learned. So before this bell was a neutral stimulus, but now it is a conditioned one because it learned it's associated with the meat powder. So when you think about babies and some examples that might happen with them, if you take the baby's bib out, that may get them really excited because they've learned that bib means it's time to eat. It's time for, mealtime. So they get really excited about that. So you can see conditioning certainly happening in infants. Now, stimulus generalization is when it begins with one stimulus, but then it starts to transfer onto other areas. So little Albert's the kind of classic example of this, and what we learned from little Albert's experiment, unfortunately, it was kind of traumatic and unethical certainly, was that the loud noise represented by the hammer right here was paired with the rat, a white rat. So basically, the little baby learned to get afraid of a white rat because initially this was a neutral stimulus. It didn't do anything, didn't have any baby reaction. But once you had the loud noise paired with it, the baby would then be startled by the rat. But they soon discovered that it wasn't just the rat that created this crying. It then became anything white and furry. So it really did extend to other white furry animals and things of that nature. So that can happen with babies as well. So it may be that maybe you didn't actually get you weren't putting the bib on, but maybe you're putting a new shirt on the baby. And as you go to do that, they think it's the bib and they start to get excited because they think they're going to get to eat. So the other type of learning, so classical conditioning is learning by association. That's the one we just reviewed with, all of the different stimuli and conditioned stimuli and responses. The other type of learning is called operant conditioning, and that is V.F. Skinner's theory. And basically what he focused on was that we learn by consequences. So you might recall from your intro days the Skinner box, where the rat inside the Skinner box, if they press this little lever here, they got a food pellet, they're going to increase the chances of pressing that little lever. If you press that and you get an electric shock, it's not going to do it so much. So basically, if you get a good consequence, you keep doing it, a bad consequence, you don't. So that's pretty much what the operant conditioning is all about. It's about the consequences. I'll give you a second to read that. Okay, so the assumption with this theory is that we are not really in control, but whoever's in control of our consequences kind of controls our behaviors. So now when we look at behavioral theories, we have a couple of different ways to impact a person. One way is through reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is going to be good consequences for a good behavior. So when we give a smile, gold stars, if you get a good grade, it's going to increase the likelihood of you engaging in those actions again. Negative reinforcement also is about increasing the behavior, but instead of giving them a good consequence, we're taking away something bad. Now, the key here is that you are taking something bad away. If you're taking something good away, then we're going to go down into the punishment area. So the goal here is that we're trying to increase the behavior. So an educational example would be the homework pass. If you do your homework Monday to Thursday, you won't have any homework on the weekend. Another example, a great example is really when you sit down in the car and it goes beep, beep, beep until you put your seatbelt on. Once you put that on, the annoying noise goes away. They're trying to increase your usage of seatbelts. The punishment approach is obviously different. What we're trying to do here is to decrease the behavior. And we can do that by yelling, screaming, a spanking, which is certainly not recommended, but those kinds of actions will decrease the behavior. So the next way of learning is observational learning. That's the third type of learning. And here, what Bandura basically said is Skinner's onto something, but it's not just about whether or not you experience a consequence. You can actually also learn by experiencing someone else experiencing the consequence rather. So by watching someone else get a good or bad consequence, you too can learn. And you might recall the famous Bobo doll study where it was looking at aggression and whether or not little children were going to act aggressively. Oops, went too far, after watching a model. So on this top row here, you can see this is about the grown-up hitting on the Bobo doll. The children who were watching this then also became very aggressive to the Bobo doll. So basically what that means is that we can learn by watching others. And imitation is a very powerful way that babies learn. No surprise, right? Mirror neurons are very cool, and I'm going to post a separate video about this because I think it's an amazing, really amazing discovery that we didn't really find out that until fairly recently. So it's not a long ago kind of discovery, but a more recent discovery. And basically what it is it's neurological evidence that observational learning really happens. What they found was that our neurons fire, it doesn't really matter whether we do the task ourselves or whether we're watching someone else do the task. So what happens is our neural pathways can be just as impacted, just by watching something. So now, of course, if we're watching something positive, that's great. But if we're watching something negative, that's not so good. So the impact is pretty significant on learning. When we look at motor development, we're going to look at this throughout the year, the different developmental stages. Gross motor development has to do with all the large body muscles that we're using. So, during the infant toddler years, babies are learning to sit up, they're learning to stand, they're learning to walk, and then eventually learning to run. Those are all motor development skills. In terms of fine motor, those are smaller base skills. So you can see here the baby trying to pick up the Cheerios. This is a very difficult task for a baby when they're, just starting out. And then being able to get that Cheerio into their mouth is another big hurdle for them to accomplish. So you could tell if you ask the baby to draw a picture or something, they're not going to be able to do that yet. Their fine motor skills are not that advanced. So as we get into the preschool years and the early childhood years, you'll see some of that shift a bit. Now, we talked about vision last chapter. I just want to mention that the vision does get back on track by 6 months. So the baby's vision is just pretty much the same as grown-ups at this time. They do have depth perception. You can see over here, this is the visual cliff experiment. And basically, this part here is just a clear glass, floor, but the checkerboard pattern that the baby sees here is down there. So they are perceiving it as a drop-off, so they won't go onto that, even though it clearly is a safe place for them to be, because they do perceive that it drops off. Babies also prefer patterns, as their vision is developing, but the interesting thing that they've discovered is that they're pretty good at telling whether that face is positive or negative. So babies have really come a long way in just a few months. So hopefully that gets you, kind of oriented to some of the key concepts in this chapter. Clearly there's lots more, but at least it gets you a head start and provides you a little bit of background knowledge before you jump into the chapter. All right, take care. I'll see you soon.